The Xerian Military Academy floated in the void like a crystalline monument to galactic superiority, its bioluminescent spires pulsing with the smug confidence of 1,000 different species who'd convinced themselves they'd figured out warfare. Which, to be fair, they mostly had, at least the civilized kind, with its neat tactical formations and predictable energy weapon exchanges. The kind of warfare that followed rules, respected boundaries, and generally avoided anything too messy or, heaven forbid, creative. The Academy's recruitment brochures, transmitted across 17 different dimensional frequencies and translated into 847 languages, proudly proclaimed it the premier institution for developing the galaxy's finest military minds. What they didn't mention, though perhaps should have, was that finest had become something of a relative term ever since the Galactic Council had decided that diversity quotas extended to species selection. Hence the recent inclusion of humans in their hallowed halls, a decision that most faculty viewed with the same enthusiasm typically reserved for mandatory sensitivity training. Humans, after all, were adorable. They came from a little blue-green marble tucked away in an unremarkable spiral arm, wielding primitive kinetic weapons and harboring the quaint belief that wars could be won through something called grit. The galactic community had collectively agreed that humans were rather like the galaxy's pet golden retrievers, enthusiastic, loyal, occasionally useful for morale, but hardly the sort you'd trust with anything genuinely important. Like advanced military strategy or sharp objects. The Academy's administrators had been quite pleased with themselves for accepting human applicants. It demonstrated their progressive values while simultaneously providing the other cadets with living examples of how not to conduct interstellar warfare. A win-win situation, really, except for the humans themselves, who remained blissfully unaware that they were essentially academic mascots. Professor Vorthak's Advanced Combat Theory classroom occupied the Academy's 7th ring, where the artificial gravity was calibrated to accommodate species ranging from the gossamerite Etherians to the dense-boned gravitons. The chamber itself was a marvel of adaptive architecture, its smart matter walls shifting to accommodate whatever tactical scenario was being discussed. Today, it had configured itself into an amphitheater arrangement, with tiered seating that allowed every cadet, regardless of their species' preferred viewing angle, optimal sight lines, to the holographic battle displays. The human cadet sat in the 3rd tier, her unremarkable brown hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail, her equally unremarkable brown eyes focused on her data tablet with a sort of casual attention that suggested she was either deeply engaged with the material or composing grocery lists. Her name was Riley Chen, though the narrator feels compelled to note that this particular human name combination had not been overused in previous stories, which was becoming something of an achievement in the increasingly crowded field of human in space fiction. Around her, the galaxy's future military elite preened and postured with the confidence that comes from belonging to species that had been conquering solar systems while humans were still figuring out agriculture. There was Zethkar of the Zephyrians, whose bioelectric field caused the air around him to shimmer with barely contained energy. His people had mastered plasma warfare 3 millennia before humans had invented gunpowder, a fact he mentioned roughly every 12 minutes. To his left lounged Krexvote, whose Kothak heritage was evident in his chitinous exoskeleton and the casual way he cracked his knuckles, all 6 sets of them. The Kothaks had built their civilization on the principle that any problem could be solved through the application of sufficient force, preferably applied repeatedly and with extreme prejudice. Their military doctrine consisted of exactly one strategy: hit it harder. The 3rd member of what Riley had privately dubbed the Smug Squadron was Lyxandra, a Vexi whose crystalline skin refracted the classroom lighting into prismatic patterns. Her people were the galaxy's premier tactical analysts, capable of calculating battlefield probabilities 17 moves in advance, while simultaneously composing what passed for poetry in their mathematical language. She viewed warfare as an elegant equation to be solved rather than a chaotic mess to be endured. Finally, there was Quindar, representative of the Drone-Tai Collective. Unlike his companions, he rarely spoke, communicating instead through the pheromone-based chemical signals that allowed his species to function as a singular hive mind. When he did vocalize, it was with the plural voice of his entire broodship, creating the unsettling effect of a single individual who insisted on using the royal we without the benefit of actual royalty. These four had appointed themselves the unofficial guardians of academic standards, taking it upon themselves to demonstrate to the various human cadets just how outclassed they truly were. It wasn't malicious, exactly, more like the sort of benevolent condescension typically shown to particularly slow house pets. Professor Vorthak clicked his mandibles for attention, the sound echoing through the smart matter walls with the authority of someone who'd spent the last 2 centuries explaining basic military concepts to species who thought they understood warfare. Today's practical assessment, he announced, his translator rendering his chittering speech into standard Galactic with only minimal static, will focus on adaptive combat scenarios. The professor was himself an Xerian, standing roughly 9 feet tall on 4 legs, with compound eyes that could track multiple targets simultaneously and a natural weapon-hardened carapace that had deflected more assassination attempts than most species had fingers. He'd earned his teaching position the traditional way, by surviving everything the galaxy had thrown at him and eventually getting too old to enjoy the throwing part. You will be divided into combat groups, Vorthak continued, manipulating the holographic display with gestures that would have looked like aggressive interpretive dance to human eyes. Each group will face a series of escalating scenarios designed to test your tactical flexibility and adaptive reasoning. Riley looked up from her tablet, noting with mild interest that the professor's compound eyes had focused on her with what she'd learned to recognize as an Xerian equivalent of a resigned sigh. In her 6 months at the academy, she developed something of a reputation. Not for excellence, the other cadets made sure of that, but for what the faculty politely termed unconventional problem-solving approaches and what her classmates less politely called completely insane human nonsense. Chen, Professor Vorthak said, and Riley could practically hear the quotation marks around her surname. You'll be working with Zethkar's group. The announcement sent a ripple of what might charitably be called anticipation through the assembled cadets. Riley's previous group assignments had developed something of a following among the student body, rather like the way crowds gathered to watch particularly spectacular vehicular accidents. The betting pools had become so elaborate that the academy had been forced to install additional processing power just to handle the transaction volume. Zethkar's bioelectric field pulsed with what Riley had learned to interpret as smug satisfaction. This was it, the moment he and his companions had been waiting for. Finally, they would have the opportunity to demonstrate to the Academy's pet human just how thoroughly outmatched she truly was. It would be educational, character-building, and, best of all, publicly humiliating. Scenario parameters, Vorthak announced as the 4 aliens rose from their seats and began moving toward Riley's position, will be determined randomly by the Academy's tactical computer. Engagement rules follow standard Academy protocols, non-lethal force only, victory conditions to be established based on scenario type. Riley closed her tablet and stood, noting with detached interest that her assigned teammates had arranged themselves in what was unmistakably a surrounding formation. Not particularly subtle, but then again, subtlety had never been their strong suit. Zethkar positioned himself directly in front of her, his energy field crackling with barely contained excitement. Krexvote moved to her right, his exoskeleton gleaming under the classroom lights. Lexandra took the left position, her crystalline features already calculating probability matrices. Quindar completed the circle behind her, his chemical emissions suggesting collective satisfaction. The other cadets had stopped pretending to review their own assignments, instead focusing entirely on the drama unfolding in the 3rd tier. Even Professor Vorthak seemed to be paying closer attention than usual, his compound eyes tracking between Riley and her surrounding classmates with what might have been professional interest or morbid curiosity. Well, Zethkar said, his bioelectric field casting dancing shadows across the smart matter walls. It seems the Academy's little pet has finally been placed in a proper learning environment. Riley looked around the circle of her teammates with the sort of calm attention typically reserved for mildly interesting museum exhibits. Her expression held no trace of concern, intimidation, or even particular interest. She might have been studying the lunch menu. The learning environment, Krexvote added, cracking his knuckles in a symphony of chitinous percussion, being one where she can observe superior tactical minds in action. Lexandra's crystalline surface refracted the light into complex patterns as she accessed her species' tactical databases. The probability matrices for this engagement favor our success by approximately 847 to 1, she announced with the satisfaction of someone who'd just solved a particularly elegant equation. Though we should perhaps adjust for the chaos factor inherent in primitive strategic thinking. Quindar's contribution came as a chemical emission that the classroom's translators interpreted as collective agreement tinged with anticipatory satisfaction. When he spoke, it was with the plural voice of his entire broodship. We concur with the tactical assessment. The human will provide an adequate demonstration of inferior combat doctrine. The surrounding cadets had now abandoned all pretense of working on their own assignments, creating an impromptu arena around the confrontation. Betting pools were being updated in real time, with odds heavily favoring the aliens. The smart money was on how quickly Riley would surrender rather than whether she would win. Riley surveyed her teammates, though the TAM seemed increasingly optimistic, with the sort of calm assessment that somehow managed to be more unsettling than any display of bravado would have been. When she finally spoke, her voice carried across the suddenly quiet classroom with perfect clarity. "So," she said, her tone conversational, almost friendly, "do you want one at a time, all together?" The question hung in the air, like a small explosive device waiting for someone to notice the timer. The surrounding cadets exchanged glances that ranged from confusion to anticipation. Professor Vorthak's compound eyes focused entirely on Riley with what was unmistakably professional interest. Zethkar's bioelectric field flickered with what might have been uncertainty. "I beg your pardon." Riley shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both casual indifference and predatory patience. "It's a simple question. You're obviously planning to demonstrate your superior tactical abilities by engaging me in combat. I'm just wondering if you'd prefer to do it sequentially or simultaneously." The casual way she discussed the prospect of facing 4-to-1 odds sent a ripple of unease through the assembled cadets. This wasn't how humans were supposed to behave when confronted with overwhelming force. They were supposed to back down, negotiate, or at least show some recognition of their precarious situation. Craig's voter's exoskeleton clicked as he shifted position, his 6 arms flexing in preparation for combat. "Your confidence is admirable, human, but misplaced. We are trained warriors from species that mastered warfare before yours had discovered fire." "Actually," Riley said, her tone taking on the patient quality typically reserved for correcting minor factual errors, "we discovered fire roughly 1.7 million years ago. We've had quite a lot of time to practice since then." Alexandra's crystalline features refracted the light into increasingly complex patterns as she recalculated her probability matrices to account for this unexpected display of human confidence. The numbers, unfortunately, remained stubbornly unchanged. "Primitive fire-starting techniques hardly constitute military preparation," she said, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been present before. Riley's smile was small, almost apologetic. "You know what? Since you can't seem to decide, I'll choose for you. Altogether it is." What happened next would be discussed in Academy tactical analysis courses for decades to come, though the discussions would focus less on the specific techniques employed and more on the fundamental assumptions about human combat doctrine that proved so dramatically incorrect. Professor Vorthak's mandibles clicked once, the Nexarian equivalent of starting a stopwatch, and the engagement began. Zethkar struck first, which was entirely predictable given both his species' preference for energy-based attacks and his position at the front of the formation. His bioelectric field discharged in a focused plasma burst that should have incapacitated Riley instantly. The attack was precisely calibrated, non-lethal but thoroughly debilitating, exactly the sort of demonstration that would prove the superiority of Xenophobic combat doctrine. Riley wasn't there when the plasma arrived. She had moved, not with the flashy acrobatics favored by species that had evolved in low-gravity environments, but with the economical precision of something that had learned to navigate a world where everything was actively trying to kill it. The plasma burst scorched the smart matter floor, where she had been standing, creating a perfectly human-shaped outline that would have been comedic if anyone had been in a mood to appreciate humor. Riley reappeared behind Zethkar's left shoulder, her movement so fluid that several observers would later swear she had simply teleported. Her hand found the nerve cluster at the base of his bioelectric organs, a pressure point that no non-Zephyrian should have known existed, and applied precisely the right amount of force to disrupt his electrical field without causing permanent damage. Zethkar collapsed like a marionette with severed strings, his bioelectric field flickering and dying as his nervous system attempted to reboot itself. The entire exchange had taken roughly 1.3 seconds. Krexvote roared, the sort of primal sound that had terrorized lesser species across half the galaxy, and launched himself at Riley with all 6 arms extended. His attack was pure Korthak doctrine, overwhelming force applied with extreme prejudice, designed to end the engagement through sheer kinetic impact. Riley ducked under his charge and swept his legs, using his own momentum against him in a maneuver that would have been simple enough if Korthak legs weren't protected by chitinous armor capable of deflecting small-caliber projectiles. Except Riley wasn't trying to damage the armor. She was targeting the joints between the plates, finding the microscopic gaps that allowed for articulation and applying pressure in directions that Korthak anatomy simply wasn't designed to accommodate. Krexvote hit the smart matter floor with a sound like a shuttle crash. His 6 arms tangled around each other in a configuration that would require several minutes and possibly professional assistance to sort out. The impact was hard enough to trigger the classroom's safety protocols, which began projecting medical assessment holograms around his sprawled form. Alexandra's crystalline features had shifted from confident tactical analysis to something approaching panic, as she recalculated her probability matrices to account for the rapidly changing battlefield conditions. The numbers were now suggesting outcomes that violated several fundamental assumptions about comparative species capabilities. She opted for psychological warfare, her crystalline form refracting the light into hypnotic patterns designed to overload human visual processing systems. It was an elegant solution. Humans were known to be particularly susceptible to certain wavelengths of light, and their primitive brains could be easily overwhelmed by complex visual stimuli. Riley closed her eyes and continued moving toward her, navigating by sound, air currents, and what could only be described as combat instinct. When she reached Alexandra's position, she opened her eyes and smiled directly into the crystalline alien's face, her expression that somehow managed to be more unsettling than any display of aggression. "Pretty lights," Riley said, and then applied pressure to what she somehow knew was Alexandra's primary optical nerve cluster. The Vexhi's hypnotic light display collapsed into chaotic prismatic fragments, as her visual processing systems overloaded and shut down. She remained conscious but effectively blind, her tactical calculations reduced to meaningless mathematical noise. Quindar had been carefully maneuvering during the engagement, his hive-mind consciousness coordinating a complex flanking maneuver designed to account for human unpredictability. His species' greatest advantage was their collective intelligence. No single individual could outthink an entire broodship working in perfect harmony. Unfortunately for Quindar, Riley wasn't trying to outthink anyone. She was operating on a level that predated complex reasoning, drawing on instincts that had been honed by millions of years of survival on a world where everything, the weather, the wildlife, the geology itself, had been actively hostile to human existence. She moved through his chemical communication field like it was fog, her human biochemistry completely unaffected by the pheromone-based signals that coordinated drone-type tactical responses. When she reached his position, she did something that no military academy in the galaxy taught. She improvised. Her attack was simultaneously precise and completely unpredictable, targeting pressure points that existed only in human anatomy but apparently had analogs in drone-type physiology. Quindar's collective consciousness fractured into individual confusion as his chemical communication systems shut down, leaving him isolated from his broodship for the first time in his life. The entire engagement had lasted roughly 37 seconds. Riley stood in the center of the classroom, surrounded by 4 incapacitated aliens who were widely considered among the galaxy's most promising military cadets, her breathing only slightly elevated and her regulation uniform showing no signs of dishevelment. She looked around at the stunned faces of her classmates with the same mild interest she'd shown when reviewing her data tablet. "Well," she said to Professor Vorthak, whose compound eyes were focused on her with unmistakable professional fascination, "what's next?" The silence in the classroom was the sort typically associated with religious experiences on natural disasters, the kind of quiet that suggested fundamental worldviews were in the process of being violently reorganized. The betting pools had crashed, their processing algorithms unable to calculate odds for outcomes that violated basic assumptions about galactic military hierarchy. Professor Vorthak clicked his mandibles slowly, the Nexarian equivalent of clearing one's throat. "Perhaps," he said, his translator struggling with what might have been wonder or concern. We should discuss human military history in more detail. The professor's statement sent another ripple through the assembled cadets, most of whom had accepted the standard galactic assessment of human military capability without bothering to examine the underlying data. Humans, after all, came from a Class 3 world in an unremarkable star system. Their technology was primitive, their weapons were crude, and their strategic thinking was simplistic. These were established facts, recorded in official databases and taught in xenology courses across the galaxy. What those databases failed to mention, though perhaps should have, was that humans came from what the galaxy's more honest xenobiologists privately termed a death world, a planet so comprehensively hostile to life that the fact that anything had survived there, let alone developed intelligence, represented a statistical impossibility that made most scientists uncomfortable. Earth's gravity was higher than galactic standard. Its atmosphere was a corrosive oxygen-nitrogen mix that would be toxic to most species. Its weather patterns included phenomena like tornadoes, hurricanes, and blizzards that would qualify as natural weapons on more civilized worlds. Its geological activity regularly reshaped entire continents through processes that other species considered acts of planetary warfare. And the wildlife. The planet's biological diversity included creatures that had evolved in an environment of constant predation, environmental catastrophe, and resource scarcity. Humans had shared their world with pack hunters, ambush predators, and creatures that viewed Homo sapiens as a convenient protein source. They had developed intelligence not as a luxury, but as a survival necessity. More importantly, they had developed it while everything around them was actively trying to kill them. Human military doctrine, Professor Vorthak began, accessing files that most academy instructors preferred not to examine too closely, is based on what they term asymmetrical warfare, the principle that conventional tactical approaches may be less effective than unconventional ones. The smart matter walls reconfigured themselves to display a series of holographic representations of human military history. The assembled cadets found themselves looking at conflicts that violated most accepted principles of civilized warfare. Humans fighting in environments that should have been uninhabitable, using weapons that shouldn't have been effective, employing strategies that made no tactical sense. The human concept of guerrilla warfare, Vorthak continued, his voice carrying the sort of professional respect typically reserved for discussing natural disasters, involved abandoning fixed positions, predictable supply lines, and conventional command structures in favor of what they call adaptive battlefield dynamics. The holographic displays showed human military units operating without central coordination, making tactical decisions based on immediate local conditions rather than overarching strategic plans. To species accustomed to the elegant predictability of proper military doctrine, it looked less like warfight and more like controlled chaos. They also employ something called combined arms tactics, the professor added, bringing up displays that showed humans integrating wildly different weapon systems and unit types in ways that violated basic principles of operational efficiency. Rather than specializing in optimal combat roles, they prefer what they term flexibility over optimization. What the professor was diplomatically not mentioning was that human military history was essentially one long demonstration of how to win fights against superior forces through the application of controlled insanity. They had developed tactics based on the assumption that their enemies would be stronger, better armed, and more numerous. Their entire strategic philosophy was built around the principle that fair fights were for species that had better options. Riley stood in the center of the classroom, listening to Professor Vorthak's lecture with the sort of polite attention typically shown to someone explaining concepts that one already understood intimately. Around her, the four aliens were slowly recovering from their various states of tactical incapacitation, though their recovery was being hampered by what appeared to be fundamental philosophical confusion. Zethkar's bioelectric field was flickering back to life, though his usual confident posture had been replaced by something approaching wariness. "How did you know about Zephyrian neural clusters?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of bewilderment. Riley shrugged. "Your species has been part of galactic civilization for 3,000 years. Your anatomy is in every xenobiology database in the Academy system. I read the files." "But those are classified medical files," Alexandra protested, her crystalline features still showing signs of optical processing strain. "They are not accessible to cadets." They weren't secured properly, Riley said, her tone suggesting that this should have been obvious. Basic information security protocols would have prevented access, but your IT department apparently assumes that no one would be interested in learning about alien physiology. The casual way she discussed circumventing Academy security systems sent another wave of unease through the assembled cadets. Most species viewed computer systems as reliable barriers that functioned according to predictable rules. The idea that these systems could be bypassed through creative interpretation of their operational parameters was profoundly unsettling. Crexvote was attempting to untangle his 6 arms from their current configuration with limited success. "Your combat techniques," he said, his voice strained with effort, "they violate basic principles of kinetic warfare. You should have been unable to generate sufficient force to penetrate Korvac armor." "I didn't penetrate your armor," Riley pointed out. "I bypassed it. Your species designed your protective systems to deflect external impacts, but you didn't account for leverage-based attacks that redirect your own kinetic energy against your structural weak points." This explanation did nothing to improve Crexvote's mood. The idea that his species' millennia of military engineering could be circumvented through creative application of basic physics was the sort of concept that required fundamental reassessment of deeply held beliefs about Korvac military superiority. Quindar was perhaps having the most difficult time processing the engagement, since his individual consciousness was still struggling to function without the collective support of his broodship's hive mind. When he finally spoke, it was with a singular voice that sounded strange and uncertain. "How did you disrupt our chemical communication systems? Humans lack the biological capability to interpret pheromone-based signals." "I didn't need to interpret them," Riley said. "I just needed to overload them. Your species relies on chemical communication for tactical coordination, which means your combat effectiveness is directly dependent on maintaining specific atmospheric chemical balances. Introduce the right kind of interference, and your coordination collapses." The right kind of interference, as it turned out, had involved exploiting the classroom's atmospheric control systems to introduce trace compounds that disrupted drone-type pheromone reception. It was the sort of environmental manipulation that required understanding both alien biochemistry and life support engineering, knowledge that no cadet should have possessed, but which Riley had apparently acquired through what she termed recreational reading. Professor Vorthak's compound eyes had remained focused on Riley throughout these exchanges, his professional fascination evident in the way his mandibles clicked in complex rhythmic patterns. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice carrying the sort of careful formality typically reserved for addressing unexploded ordnance, "perhaps you could explain how you developed these combat techniques." Riley looked around the classroom, noting the mixture of fascination and concern on the faces of her classmates. "I studied the available data," she said. "Every species in this academy has been part of galactic civilization for centuries or millennia. Your military doctrines, tactical preferences, physiological characteristics, and technological capabilities are all documented. I just read the documentation and worked out countermeasures." The simplicity of this explanation was somehow more unsettling than any complex strategic theory would have been. She hadn't developed these techniques through years of specialized training or access to classified military intelligence. She had simply read publicly available information and drawn logical conclusions about how to exploit the weaknesses that every species had developed through centuries of fighting predictable enemies using conventional tactics. But the tactical calculations alone, Alexandra protested, her crystalline features refracting light into patterns of confusion, processing that much strategic data should require computational assistance. "How did you analyze probability matrices for 4 different combat scenarios simultaneously?" Riley's expression suggested that she was struggling to explain something that should have been self-evident. "I didn't calculate probabilities. I just adapted to changing conditions as they developed. Your species approach combat like it's a mathematical equation to be solved, but equations assume that all the variables are known and constant. Real combat involves too many unknown factors for mathematical analysis to be reliable." This statement struck at the heart of galactic military doctrine, which was built on the principle that superior technology and tactical analysis could reduce warfighting to a predictable science. The idea that combat might be inherently chaotic, requiring adaptation rather than calculation, was profoundly disturbing to species that had spent millennia perfecting their strategic methodologies. The classroom's smart matter walls had been displaying Professor Vorthak's tactical analysis throughout the discussion, showing slow-motion replays of Riley's movements during the engagement. What the analysis revealed was even more unsettling than the original combat had been. Her techniques had no consistent pattern. Each attack had been perfectly adapted to the specific opponent and situation, but there was no underlying system that could be studied, replicated, or counted. She had fought like water flowing around obstacles, taking the path of least resistance and exploiting every available opportunity without any apparent overall strategy. It was the sort of combat doctrine that violated every principle of military science while being devastatingly effective. The humans, Professor Vorthak said, his voice taking on the tone typically reserved for delivering particularly grim diagnoses, appear to have developed military capabilities that are not reflected in our current threat assessments. This statement, delivered in the careful language of academic understatement, sent a ripple of unease through the assembled cadets. If humans could develop these capabilities without triggering galactic intelligence monitoring systems, what other surprises might their species be concealing? The Academy's threat assessment protocols were based on observable technological development, military infrastructure, and strategic resource allocation. Humans scored low in all these categories, indicating that they posed minimal threat to galactic security. What the protocols had failed to account for was the possibility that a species might develop combat capabilities that didn't require advanced technology or formal military infrastructure. Riley had demonstrated techniques that were simultaneously primitive and sophisticated, requiring no special equipment, while being devastatingly effective against opponents who outclassed her in every measurable category. It was the sort of military capability that could exist undetected until it was employed, making threat assessment virtually impossible. Perhaps, said a voice from the back of the classroom, we should reconsider the Academy's admission policies regarding human applicants. The suggestion came from Vex Thilla, a senior cadet whose crystalline Vex-I heritage marked her as one of Lyxandra's brood sisters. Her comment carried the sort of careful diplomatic phrasing that indicated serious policy discussions were likely to follow. Professor Vorthak's compound eyes swept across the assembled cadets, noting the mixture of fascination, concern, and what might charitably be called professional paranoia that Riley's demonstration had inspired. The Academy's policies, he said carefully, are determined by the Galactic Council's educational directives. However, recent events may warrant reassessment of current tactical curricula. What he was diplomatically not saying was that Riley's performance had revealed fundamental flaws in the galaxy's understanding of human military potential. If a single human cadet could neutralize four elite alien warriors using nothing but publicly available information and improvised tactics, what might human military forces be capable of if they ever decided to take galactic politics seriously? The implications were particularly disturbing given humanity's recent admission to the Galactic Council as a junior member species. Their primitive technology and limited interstellar presence had made them seem like harmless newcomers who could be safely ignored, while more established species handled the serious business of galactic governance. Riley stood in the center of the classroom, apparently oblivious to the existential crisis her demonstration had triggered among the galaxy's future military leaders. Her expression remained calm and attentive, as if she were waiting for the next portion of the day's lesson to begin. "Miss Chen," Professor Vorthak said, his mandibles clicking in what might have been resignation, "would you be interested in guest lecturing for our advanced tactical analysis course?" The question hung in the air, like a small diplomatic incident waiting to happen. The advanced tactical analysis course was restricted to senior cadets from species with established military traditions, taught by professors who had earned their positions through centuries of combat experience and strategic innovation. Inviting a first-year human cadet to address the class was tantamount to acknowledging that the galaxy's military establishment might have some significant gaps in their understanding of warfare. Riley considered the invitation with the same mild interest she'd shown throughout the entire engagement. Would I be expected to follow the standard curriculum, or could I discuss alternative tactical approaches? The careful way she phrased the question suggested that she had additional insights to share, which was somehow more concerning than any direct threat would have been. If a casual demonstration of human combat capabilities was merely an introduction to more comprehensive tactical knowledge, the galaxy's military academies were facing a rather significant educational crisis. Alternative approaches, Professor Vorthak said slowly, might indeed be valuable for our cadets' educational development. As the class period concluded and cadets began filing out of the amphitheater, conversations buzzed with speculation about what Riley's demonstration meant for galactic military doctrine. The betting pools had evolved from simple wagering on combat outcomes to complex probability matrices attempting to assess the strategic implications of human military capabilities. Riley packed a data tablet with the same casual efficiency she'd shown throughout the engagement, apparently unaware that she had just initiated what would likely become the most comprehensive reassessment of galactic military doctrine in recorded history. Her demonstration had revealed that the galaxy's understanding of human capabilities was not merely incomplete, it was fundamentally wrong. The 4 alien cadets who had surrounded her at the beginning of class were still processing the philosophical implications of their tactical defeat. Each had been forced to confront the possibility that their species' military traditions, developed over millennia and refined through countless conflicts, might be vulnerable to approaches that violated every principle of civilized warfare. As Riley walked toward the classroom exit, she paused next to Professor Vorthak's lectern. "Professor," she said, her voice carrying the sort of polite courtesy typically reserved for minor administrative inquiries, "would it be possible to access the Academy's historical combat records? I'd like to review previous engagement data to better understand galactic tactical preferences." The request, delivered with perfect academic propriety, sent a chill through the remaining cadets who were still within hearing range. If Riley could neutralize 4 elite warriors using only basic physiological data, what might she accomplish with access to comprehensive military records? Professor Vorthak's compound eyes focused on her with what could only be described as professional wariness. "I'm certain," he said carefully, "that appropriate research materials could be made available through proper academic channels." What he was diplomatically not mentioning was that Riley's research request would likely trigger security reviews at the highest levels of Academy administration. Her casual demonstration had revealed capabilities that warranted careful monitoring, if not outright concern. As Riley left the classroom, the remaining cadets found themselves facing a rather uncomfortable realization. The galaxy's newest member species might not be the harmless primitives they had assumed. If humans could develop such devastating combat capabilities while appearing to pose minimal strategic threat, what other surprises might they be concealing? The Academy's intelligence services would spend the following months attempting to answer that question, reviewing everything from human historical records to contemporary military developments. What they would discover would lead to the first comprehensive reassessment of galactic threat protocols in over 1,000 years. But that, as they say, is another story entirely. For now, it was sufficient to note that the galaxy's military academies had just learned that their understanding of human capabilities was not merely incomplete, it was dangerously wrong. And Riley Chen, blissfully unaware of the strategic panic she had initiated, was looking forward to her next advanced combat theory class with a sort of mild anticipation typically reserved for particularly interesting puzzles. After all, she still had quite a lot of reading to catch up on.